Hey leaders, welcome to our leader resource for this week. This week we cover kind of the expanse of the book of Exodus. And so we're reminded of how Israel becomes a nation. Through Abraham, it's promised that God would bring about a people, that there would be this promised son, there'd be this promised land, there would be an expanse. And so as we see Abraham and his family become Isaac, who then becomes Jacob, and Jacob has his 12. They move to Egypt because of Joseph. We cover that in back end of Genesis. Now they've landed themselves in Egypt, as God actually promised Abraham to be sojourners for about 400 years, and that he would bring them out. And so now it's that moment of, again, another promise, God bringing them out. And we land with Moses. And as we travel through the story of Moses and the people of Israel, God delivers them. And this is an amazing story. God delivering them, showing his power and his might over the gods of Egypt and over Pharaoh and this powerful nation. God just absolutely crushes them, absolutely shuts them down. And so he's delivered his people. Yes, this is amazing. Moses is establishing himself as the leader. We are rolling. And then we get to this moment where God brings his new people to Mount Sinai. And something to remember that we need to be familiar with, that a theme in the Bible is that whenever there's a mountain involved or a garden involved, this is where the divine met with humanity, was on mountains and in gardens. And that's why Eden, going all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, Eden is described as both a mountain and a garden. This is significant. So God brings his people to a mountain to interact with them. And already off the bat, you have God saying, I want my people to come up, and we're going to have this ceremony. Almost think of it like a marriage ceremony. Like we're going to be together. I'm going to be their God, and they are going to be my people. It's this beautiful thing. And already Israel's like, God's too scary, right? There's peals of thunder, there's earthquakes, all kinds of craziness going on. People are like, I don't want anything to do with this God. He is way too much for me. So they send Moses up. Moses begins to interact with God. As they're waiting for him, Exodus 32, they build a calf and they declare, these are the gods that brought us out of Egypt. And you're like, you just face palm. You're like, what are you doing? And as God has to deal with that, as Moses deals with that, there's already issue, there's already rebellion being stirred up in the nation of Israel. But then we get, toward the end of our discussion, we get to Exodus chapter 34. Now, for most of our groups, we have touched on and maybe talked at length at Exodus 34 and the character of God, verses 6, 7, and 8 of Exodus 34. And in particular, I want to just remind us that this is what we're going to see contrasted. We're going to see the character of God played out. In fact, we've already seen the character of God played out. And we're going to continue to see it as we move through the story. So I want this to be a pivotal moment of remembrance for us, to have this in the back of our minds of this is who God is. And it is in contrast to what we see with the nation of Israel. And it's in contrast to see what it means to be human. And so again, just to remind you, God says that he is merciful, that he is gracious, that he's slow to anger, abounding in loyal love, and he's faithful. Now again, that slow to anger one is important for us to just kind of hone in on for a second, because that slow to anger, like, he's not an angry God. That's what that means. He is not an angry God. He's actually a patient God. He's slow to anger. And he continues in verse 8 where he says, but I will by no means clear the guilty, meaning that he's a just God. Right? And he's just because he cares, and he's just because when iniquity and sin is twisting his people, it hurts. And so we're reminded of, okay, this is who God is. And now I think the question we have to have in the back of our minds as we progress through this story is this really God's character? Does God actually play out? Does he remain faithful? Does he stay consistent throughout the Old Testament, into the time of Jesus, and even into our time now? Does God's character stay consistent? And what I want us to begin to think through is how many different ways, even already in the book of Exodus, have we seen God be merciful and gracious, slow to anger. Let me give you a hint. Interaction with Moses is a great example of how he is slow to anger. Because in fact, he gets angry with Moses because Moses over and over again is like, I'm not the guy. And the Hebrew idiom that's used there is actually that God's nose burned hot. That's just like, you think of a bowl, like, blowing it out. That's what it means when we read things like the wrath of God, or that God, is angry. It's that his nose burns hot. But what's amazing is though God's nose burns hot at Moses, right away he shows mercy and he says, okay, fine, I'll send Aaron with you to go talk to Pharaoh. So already we're seeing glimpses of who God is, and this is God revealing his character. So this is significant when you think of what does it look like for the nation of Israel to follow God, and by extension, as this side of the cross, what does it look like for us now as Gentiles grafted back into this family of God? What does this mean for us? So I want to leave that with you. Just continue to pour over and meditate on the character of God as we go through this series, but in particular, tonight's message on Wednesday, the 21st of October. What does it mean for Israel to be brought out and for God to be their people? So, with that, hope you have an amazing night.